Hello and welcome to She Rises. This is a podcast for Christian women who love God but are tired of living in survival mode and want more than another promise of peace. Here we explore foundations, identity and biblical worldview, learning how to rebuild wisely so our lives and homes are shaped by truth rather than reaction and steadiness rather than strain. I'm Joanne Hewlett and I'm so glad that you're here. Now, when we lived in France for a season, we bought an old police house, l'Ancienne Gendarmerie, which sounds terribly romantic when you say it quickly. In reality, it was one of those properties that look full of character until you begin to notice the practical details. The stone walls were beautiful, the ceilings high, the windows generous, but the floors sloped ever so slightly in directions they weren't meant to slope. And there was a quiet dampness creeping up through parts of the lower walls that no amount of fresh paint was going to solve. At first, like most enthusiastic renovators, you're drawn to the visible improvements. You imagine the colours, the lighting, the furniture placement. You could see what it could become. But very quickly, we realised that if we ignored what was happening beneath the surface, whatever we built on top would eventually be affected. You can redecorate endlessly, but if moisture is sitting in the foundations, it will make itself known again. And I've been thinking about that recently in relation to peace. Because many Christian women love God sincerely. They pray, they listen, they try to respond wisely rather than react quickly. They organise their weeks, they attempt better rhythms, they mean well. And yet sometimes peace feels surprisingly fragile. A busy stretch or a tensed conversation, a comment that lands awkwardly and suddenly the calm feels thinner than it did the day before. Have you ever noticed that sense of, I was doing so well, what happened? It can be deeply discouraging because it feels as though effort should have secured something more solid. Now, Jesus once told a very simple story about two houses. It comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. After all the teaching about prayer, anxiety, judgment, obedience, trust, he describes two builders who both hear his words, both build a house, both experience rain, wind, and flood. The storm comes to each of them. The difference isn't sincerity, it isn't enthusiasm, it isn't even exposure to good teaching. They all had the same. The difference is foundation. One had built on rock, hearing and putting his words into practice. The other has built on sand, hearing but not forming life around what was heard. And when the storm arrives, it doesn't create the weakness, it reveals it. There's something sobering in that, but there's also something merciful. Storms are not optional in this life. Pressure is not unusual. The question is not whether the rain will fall, it is what the rain will uncover. And I wonder whether some of our frustration with fragile peace isn't about how hard we're trying, but about what we're building on. It's entirely possible to become very skilled at decorating your life. You can refine your routines, adjust your tone, improve your time management, learn new strategies for calm. None of these things are wrong. In fact, they're often very wise. But if there is tension in the structure underneath, cosmetic improvements won't remove it. Now, when we were renovating in France, I remember the moment we realised that the damp had to be addressed before anything else. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't feel like progress in the way that new tiles felt like progress. But if the water continued to sit where it shouldn't, everything above it suffers. In the same way, you can build a life that looks orderly and still find yourself bracing internally. You can function well, serve faithfully, even lead confidently, and yet feel a subtle tightening in the walls when pressure rises. It isn't dramatic, it's just there. And over the coming weeks, we're going to explore a word that many of us don't readily apply to ourselves: survival. Not in an extreme sense, but in the quiet, habitual sense that keeps you alert, managing, compensating. Survival can look very respectable. It can look responsible, capable, even strong, but it builds with a certain tension, and tension over time shows. When Jesus speaks about building on rock, he doesn't shame the listener. He simply states a reality. Hearing without forming life around his words is like building on sand. The storm will come either way. So if peace keeps slipping, perhaps the issue is not that you're failing. Perhaps it's that God, in his kindness, is exposing what needs reinforcing. That can feel uncomfortable because exposure always does, but it's far better to strengthen foundations while the house is still standing than wait for it to collapse. What if the wobble you feel is not proof of weakness, but actually an invitation to build differently? That is where this new series is heading, not toward more effort or adding habits for the sake of it, but towards examining structure. What shapes our reactions? What have we assumed is solid that may in fact be shifting sand? What does it really mean to hear Christ's words and quietly, steadily shape our inner architecture around them? Because perhaps we don't need a prettier room. Perhaps we just need reinforced walls. And that's not criticism, it's hope. So this week's gentle nudge is not to challenge anything yet, but it's just simply observe. When something unsettles you, a comment or a delay or a child's resistance or maybe a piece of news, notice your first internal movement. Do you brace? Do you rush to fix? Do you withdraw? Or do you begin to over-explain? No judgment, just curiosity. Storms reveal the structure. Let them show you what might need strengthening. And if you begin thinking, yes, I do need to do some work, then the Rise and Restore course is ideal for this series. It will help explore faith, identity, emotional healing, boundaries, and rebuilding inner steadiness in a way that many women use alongside this podcast, simply as a place to go deeper with what's already stirring. And podcast listeners can use the code podcast for 25% off. Also, don't let finances hold you back. If you're in a season where paying isn't possible, reach out, because I keep a number of free spaces aside each month, trusting God to provide for every woman who genuinely needs support. Everything is available at johewlettauthor.com. And if this episode has resonated with you, stay with me, because next week we're going to begin naming gently what survival can look like in the life of a sincere Christian woman and why it can feel so entirely normal. Until next time, live steadily, think deeply, and keep building wisely.